Okay. Good morning, NYUAD, and I guess hello, YouTube. That's one ambition ticked off this morning. Yep. Who am I? My name is Sergio Luke. I'm Principal Advisor with T-Carter. So I'll start by just saying a few words about who T-Carter are. We are a merry band of cartographers, developers, GIS practitioners. We are based in sometimes sunny, not always southern Sweden, about an hour just over on the Swedish side of this rather beautiful and famous Öresund Bridge, or Bridge and Tunnel. And we were born in 1985. So we are 1 year away from celebrating our 40th birthday. You're all invited next year, by the way. So I wish I was still 1 year away from celebrating my 40th birthday, but that's another matter. Who do we work with? Well, we principally, on the part of T-Carter that I work for, we principally work with city and transport authorities, people you might have heard of, such as the New York DOT and the MTA, City of Toronto, Transport for London, which is actually my past in a previous life, SL in Stockholm, Ile-de-France Mobilité in the Paris region, and manufacturers such as Siemens. And what do we do for them? Well, essentially we do maps. We are, as I said, cartographers, but we design, build, and deploy cartographic databases, mapping systems, most probably visible and famous for large-scale pedestrian wayfinding systems such as Walk NYC and Legible London. And our maps support, obviously, public transport, but also active modes such as cycling and walking. We are not really designers. I remember when I joined the UITP committee about 5 years ago, I started with an apology saying that nobody at T-Carter actually had design in their job title. That's actually changed fairly recently, but we still struggle a little bit with the mantle of designers. We're more map nerds, I guess. We're proud to say that for each of these projects, we are the only original part of the consortium still working in things such as Legible London and Walk NYC. And for a system such as Legible London, we manage, this is the extent of it, somewhere behind all these map frames, you'll see a geographic outline of London, and there are around about 11,000 location-specific maps that we deploy, manage, maintain, update on behalf of Transport for London. So yes, some of the things we do, these are some examples. I wanted this to really symbolize how we view our products, both as maybe pieces of art, but that's very subjective, but more to think of the entry points to the transport network, to the transport system, as if it was an art gallery. So you want to put your best offer on display to try and entice as many people into your system as possible. This kind of mixed metaphor of a bus shelter art gallery, with the maps being the thing that calls you in, that brings you in, that advertises the service that you're offering, presents the best of your network. So that's T-Carter. A slightly more personal introduction, inspired by the very warm welcome that I've received since I arrived in the UAE a couple of days ago. I am half English, half Trinidadian, with a Portuguese name. Depending on who asks me, I could say Portuguese, Spanish, Italian. I can change it. But currently living in France, working for a Swedish company, standing to you today at the Abu Dhabi campus of an American university. as the host, hosted by, or the guest of, an Italian associate professor, invited here by a French Canadian and a Serb who was raised in France, who currently lives in Spain. So, and of course, as I've been informed, that NYUAD has 110 nationalities present here, and I absolutely love this. And I think it's been said a few times. It's been said a few times in the symposium, really. But there is something about transport, and maybe there's something about transport mapping in particular that brings people together. And I think right now we could all do with a little bit more togetherness. So that's probably about as serious note as I'm going to make in the whole talk. But today the title is In Stasis, Designing Static Information for a Dynamic World. But maybe the subtitle should be, Are we still relevant? Am I still relevant? Maybe I'm having a midlife crisis, but this is all I've been thinking about. And are we still relevant today in a digital world? I've shown you that what we primarily produce at T. Carter is maps that end up printed, so static information. And yet, all around us, we're bombarded by influences that are dynamic. You know, our transport system, our cities, we're not slowing down anytime soon. And a huge proportion of what we do still goes up as something that was produced essentially in the past. And it's kind of a promise of what might be happening now or might be happening in the future, but it's a static piece of information. And we keep on asked, like, are we still aligned with the needs of the modern user? You know, they ask us this, and of course you've probably heard this, and maybe you've even asked this question yourself, doesn't everybody just use Google now, or Apple? But who are these they? When we really care about the work that we do, we care about detail, we care about accuracy. This is actually the process that we went through, a very manual process to actually build the Legible London database in the first place, was literally to sit there with about 1,600 huge printouts, each of a plot, and manually mark them up. And it was 11 months of just solid work, but incredibly engaging at the same time. You can get people around a single table, get your pens out, your highlighters. It's very tactile, it's very manual, but it's very engaging. And we care about that. But here we are today at a time when perhaps more than ever users just want a quick answer rather than the best answer. This is the kind of the environment that we're working in. And I said that we keep on asked, are we still relevant? Who asked us this? Was actually our customers. Our clients are asking this. This is a survey conducted by Transport for London a couple of years ago now, but I think the findings are still hold true now, about future-proofing Legible London. You know, is it still relevant today when everybody carries around a smartphone and everybody can navigate theoretically at will? And, well, the answer, spoiler alert, thankfully, yes, we're still relevant, okay? Short talk, that's it, done, no. And to be honest, that should not be a surprise to anybody in this room. We know that static information still has significant benefits, even in 2024. Obviously offers confirmation, offers reassurance, it's a trusted source, it can convey authority, it can be integrated easily with other information systems. Not everybody can or wants to use their mobile phone at all times. So yeah, you know, static information still has its place. But just to quickly call back to Jug's slide from yesterday morning and what we are going to move on to Dubai and present to the UITP MENA Congress tomorrow morning, we are now placing that within a framework which up until now I always thought, is it an opposition thing? Is it basically static versus dynamic? Is it digital versus print? But it's not. These things exist together in a kind of framework, and they can be complementary. They don't need to be, sort of against each other. But yet, I think there's still a perception that static information at some point will be the past, and we'll have moved on to this, bright new future where everything is live, real time, and digital, maybe. It's just that we imagined it would be a lot quicker, so we managed probably it's going to be a straightforward, linear journey from starting all the way down there. When you work in a very static environment, you have a very static output, maybe then you progress slightly to a more manual process, maybe if you're lucky you get to hybrid and then eventually develop like dynamic outputs. Eventually this is maybe the perceived end goal is to have everything fully automated, whatever that might mean, but the reality of course, is not a linear straight line at all. And this is probably not even true. We're somewhere around here in the middle where, of course, we're all things at once. We are static, dynamic, manual, and automated all at the same time. And really, this is where we're finding ourselves. And this, for me, is the most fascinating thing, I think, at the moment. As I started to think about what I'd like to talk to you about today, and I was thinking about this idea of, are we still relevant? The more I looked into it, I found something really interesting happening, that I think that dynamic information, or the design of dynamic information, now feeding back into static information. So there are elements that have maybe been introduced through the design of interactive and dynamic systems that now static information is reflecting. There's this kind of feedback loop that's happening, but that's probably enough metaphors for the moment. Let's start looking at some actual examples. I'll start right at the beginning, right at the base, literally with a base map, and thinking about base map styles. And of course, we'll all be familiar now that in the digital realm, online, you can, as a user, you can manipulate the actual base map that you see, and that can be tailored for different purposes. So you can start with something here like OpenStreetMap's so-called standard base map. So it's what I think of as very naturalistic styling. So greens for green space, blues for water features, a more kind of brick, earthy, brown color for the built-up areas, maybe the industrial. The rail lines are very heavy, to kind of reflect their actual physical nature. Then in the digital world, of course, you can very easily, seamlessly switch to an adapted base map. Here we have OSM's cycling base, where you still get some of the naturalistic styling, you still get some of the greens, and you see the blues coming through, of course. But then the built-up has been pushed back. That's been generalized a lot more, and now the kind of cycle possibilities are brought forward, all the way through to something like OSM's transport map, which really just shows or highlights the roads that are taken by public transport. So, of course, there are other pieces of information shown here. Hubs are named or stops are named. But I've been thinking, what would this look like if we kind of took this principle and we adapted it, or we transferred it into the static or the printed world? So we start off with a product that is a real one, a live one for the City of Toronto project. These are local area maps at TTC stations in Toronto, and here this is the actual styling that we use, and again it's very naturalistic. You have greens for green space, you have actually this kind of this blue is meant to be a theme on the whole of the City of Toronto system. It's meant to reflect the actual color of the roofs when viewed from a bird's eye perspective. But I wanted to start to play with this to see if I could make it more adapted for its actual real use, which is to highlight the transport network. So, well, okay, what if we drain the color out of it? And thankfully this display is incredibly good at draining color out of anything. So this is just an automated grayscale recoloring in Illustrator. This is no thought involved as well, literally just apply that automatically. But then just to do it with a slightly more purposeful, intentful aim, maybe max out the contrast, see if you can really simplify the shapes of the road network, try to highlight where the buses may run, but that's probably not enough because now you've kind of lost, everything's maybe a bit too flat. So what you can do, maybe that shows just about well enough. So you can then just bring up, when you've got everything else knocked back, you can then bring back up the transport network. And maybe if you zoom in a little bit, you can see that slightly better. Where now the focus is primarily just through the use of color, things that are colored are what you're interested in, things that are grayscale you're less interested in, and it's the transport that comes to the fore. And it's actually quite neat, quite useful that TCC's kind of brand color is red, so that's a very strong standout against the grayscale background. This is just a proof of concept, it's not live, maybe just as well, Alex, I think. It's not a real concept, it's not polished in any way. But for an example which definitely is a lot more refined and polished, I'd like to introduce the work of Aurélien Boyer-Moresh, who's a French-Portuguese cartographer and an incredible collector of transport maps, city maps, all kinds of maps that we might be talking about here this week, where he's done a very similar thing. He's used extreme contrast of greys and very dark, almost black lines for the transport network and the kind of red contrast to bring out the route numbers for his map of Turin. And of course, another way that dynamic could be feeding back into static at the moment is this concept of orientation. So obviously with the dynamic map, you're able either at the will of the user, or if the app actually takes control for you, it'll rotate the world around you as you move. And we're all very familiar with this now. We see it every day when we use maps on our phones. But in the static world, of course, this concept has kind of existed for a long time anyway, especially with the legible cities movements, through the concepts of heads-up mapping. Now, you might just about be able to see that well enough. But heads-up mapping is really the idea that the map should look the same way that you are looking as the user. So here we have a pedestrian wayfinding sign along the south bank of the Thames in London, and the map doesn't have north at the top, it has the direction that you're facing. It's really clear if you see that the river is just the other side of this barrier here. The map is looking the same way, so it theoretically lowers the cognitive load on the user. They can just glance at the map as they're walking past and don't even need to really break their journey, they can keep on walking. Or, and this is going to maybe call back to the interesting discussion we had yesterday about distortion and compression of certain areas. You can play with that idea that you don't have to stick with static geographic mapping, you don't have to have north at the top as default. You can distort and you can play with this. Here's an example from Auckland, Newmarket near the city centre of Auckland, where this is with north at the top, but you can see this area at Newmarket has a kind of natural dogleg feel. And the problem with this very narrow formatted product, which has to sit within a frame that's very narrow and is positioned on a bus stop, it makes it slightly awkward to position the transport information, these boxes, these tabs around. You can't really do it too neatly. So what you might do to try and avoid or manipulate this kind of dogleg effect is just very subtly rotate the map within a certain tolerance. So now you don't have north at the top. North is now somewhere over there, but instantly you've created this kind of grid-like axis, almost along cardinal degrees, where you can much more easily, you've created space for yourself to then align the tabs on a grid. And that just makes it easier to read. It's, you can contrast maybe maybe it's a bit too subliminal in this particular example, but you can kind of contrast the rigidity and the sort of 90-degree angles of the transport information against the more slightly chaotic real-world base map underneath. Yep. And there's the two side by side. And another tactic, another weapon in your armory for introducing kind of things that are fairly standard in dynamic mapping back into static. It's this idea of focusing. What do I mean by how we focus? Well, with a dynamic map, of course, you can simply zoom in and out. You can either choose the focus of your own accord, you can select things and the map will automatically pan or zoom to that particular location. And the focus, you can drill down several different levels to reveal more information, to reduce the amount of information shown. And of course, that's very obviously a feature of dynamic mapping. But focus is very important for static mapping as well. I'm going to give you this example here of a project that we're working on in Geneva, where we were asked to come in and redesign their local plan de connexion, so it's the maps that you have up at every stop, and they are focused on hubs. The way that Geneva has arranged their bus and tram network is around this concept of mini hubs everywhere. There's probably around about 100 in the city, and incredibly well standardized concept. You see with their existing product, before we came in, they had not one but two indexes. So just basically different ways of presenting information, but using this fairly conventional, maybe we'd say quite old school way of presenting static information is combining a map and then asking people to then make sense of not one here, but two indexes. And you've got to constantly refer between the map and the index and back again. And of course, that creates more cognitive load. That introduces the possibility that people might mislink things and they might not associate things right on the map with the index. So we wanted to be quite brave in redesigning it. It wasn't just going to be an aesthetic redesign. We wanted to actually just get rid of the indexes altogether. No indexes, no legend, no key. Don't explain anything. Just present as if it was a dynamic map, which typically wouldn't have an index. Just present what you want to present in a single view and focus the user. So you just show the transport information. Now, instead of having to refer to it off on one side and then back to the map, it's on the map already. So you can see the location of stops. You can see the direction that the transport is moving in. You can see which services call at each stop, where they might be going. And so that's the general idea there, is to introduce this kind of focus on behalf of the user. Also, with these particular products, we wanted to sort of establish a hierarchy between the transport information and then the area information underneath, to provide, again, to help provide with focus. And we did that through sort of applying sort of a simulation of depth. So the transport information is given this kind of drop shadow effect where it literally looks as if it's above above the actual representation of the streets. And everything, if we go back, everything that you see actually above the base map has this kind of drop shadow effect. It more or less comes out on the screen. But it's just to separate it, have that separation, so you can quickly scan, you can make maybe a different, you can pick out easily what is transport information and what is base map without really consciously having to work it through. And you can arrange these tabs in the hierarchy of their own. I won't go into the details here, but basically there's 6, maybe 7 different levels of tabs going through depending on exactly where you're positioned as to how much information they show, what the information is, how specific it might be to a particular stop or more to like a hub level of information. We did this kind of very, probably too subtle again, effect, trying to simulate what you experience when you use a digital dynamic map product. Is this kind of coloring in of the actual stop that is the focus point, as if you'd selected it, as if you'd actually has a sort of on-off state. But we, again, tried to implement that in a static environment on behalf of the user. And yeah, that's just a little bit more about the levels there. So as I said, you have this transport information that's meant to be really hovering above the base map itself, and then creates that shadow underneath. Another thing we tried to do just with text, because the way that I guess we've all been trained now to look at anything, and I find myself doing this, doesn't matter if it's a screen, doesn't matter if it's print, I cannot read from top to bottom anymore. I just cannot do it. So I scan. And even if it's printed and it's a book, I find myself going in at the middle of the page and then back to the top and then down, and it's so mind-numbingly frustrating for me. I cannot unprogram this now. But being aware of this fact, we wanted to allow people to scan the different kind of levels of text that you might find on a map such as that, just by the way that we arrange the text, that we lay out the text itself. So if it's a point of interest, then the text will be horizontal, and this is lucky, 99.9% of points of interest labels are more than one word, so you can introduce a line break. So if it's horizontal and it has a line break, then we're trying to encode that that's a point of interest. Versus the roads, where they're always going to be on a single line, they're always going to be aligned with the road itself. So just to kind of separate the two things, you have obviously the font is the same, the color is slightly different. I know you can't see that. The point size might be the same, I'm not too sure. It's very similar anyway if it's not exactly the same, but the way we treat the text is different, and that is enough just to create this kind of hierarchy between different types of text. And then the last one, there's only 2 examples in this particular map. It's to again bring back our old friend, the drop shadow. I know for a lot of designers, drop shadows are illegal. I love them, sorry. And this is for area names. Again, the thing with an area, especially in a city like Geneva, is that so many people, if it's not legally defined, cannot agree where one area stops and starts. So we try to say, okay, well, this is roughly where Cité is, this is roughly where Plainpalais is, but maybe not. So just to give it this drop shadow, as if that text could also be moving, could be kind of raised above the base map. We did want to suggest it was fixed in a particular point. Aurélien, again, I am a fan, I must admit. This is a map that he's drawn of, I think it's a historical tram network in Buenos Aires. And he's used this kind of both geometry and also this kind of false depth effect, this kind of false 3D effect in his work. And that's actually been quite a big inspiration on what we do. Keep in shape. really am having a midlife crisis. I know, Yo, this has become a favourite map of mine now as well, and Yuka said it a lot, and I'll pick out one reason why. And you might disagree with me why, but I love this when I realized it's because it gets rid of this convention where the shape of the lines has to give way for the placement of the text. It's not afraid to let the text just completely sit above the line, so the line shape is retained, and it's the line shape that forms the mental image in your head. Forget the text, doesn't matter. But the actual shape, that's what you want people to have, the network in their mind. And that's compared to... Will he play? Yes. There's another map of a network not too far from Paris, or sometimes it feels like it's a long way, where the actual shape of the map itself has been completely undermined by this hard and fast rule: you cannot let text and line interact. Unfortunately, as the network has developed, especially with new line going on, that kind of memorable shape as it used to be is being degraded more and more. So, which is a shame. One thing that personal devices are not particularly good at is having the physical space for showing the entire network, as I think was referenced already earlier this morning. Often, of course, we got this kind of this particular view, and okay, you can zoom in, zoom out, but you can never really get it to fit the actual shape of the network that you want people to implant in their minds. At least maybe not yet, but what's this? And what is Vision? Sorry, what is Apple Vision Pro? Hold on, did somebody say it? Yes is the right answer. It's a spatial computer. And that's Apple's terminology, of course, but it's perfect. It's perfect for this particular talk because it solves potentially the big problem with that, space. So now you have a theoretically infinite, maybe, not quite, but a much larger canvas on which, apologies, and to Yuka, you could maybe one day do something like that. We'll see. Thought I'd try and introduce a little bit of science. Well, what counts as science in our discipline anyway. Heuristics, which is, I don't know if it was coined by Jakob Nielsen, but it's one of Jakob Nielsen came up with 10 general principles for interaction design. Heuristics are not meant to be hard and fast rules, they're more meant to be rules of thumb. But there's one particular rule of thumb that I love, number 9, which is you should help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. And this is obviously something that dynamic tools, dynamic information can do really well because it can adapt to context, it can allow users to retrace their steps or to cancel or whatever it might be to reset. But how does static information perform the same trick? Well, imagine that you are back at Newmarket Station in Auckland. Train's just arrived and you're running down the stairs trying to catch the train, and you're presented with this map, this static map. But you're running down the stairs. What do you really need to know? You need to know, is this the train that I need to get? Is it going to go where I want to go? Does this map help you? Maybe. Maybe not in isolation. Does this map help you? Well, it tells you where you might be going. But say if you happen to be intending to go in another direction, in the opposite direction, maybe you prefer to see something like this, where it's a balance of both showing you where you can go from that particular platform and also allowing you, if you've made a mistake and you found the wrong platform, to discover that you should be going to a different platform. So just subtle kind of using color and knockback to kind of use deliberate prejudice. I don't know what the right term would be. But just to allow you to realize you may have made a mistake. And I don't know why, but this is not common among static signage, especially in London and Paris, in cities I guess I know the best. It's kind of showing what's behind you effect. There's a 3 alongside. I just want to end by maybe after kind of argue for the relevance of static information and show how it can still justify itself in our dynamic world. Just give you a quick warning against complacency maybe for static information, and how sometimes static tends to be still too attached to old, maybe decades old standards and practices, and it's a bit too dogmatic in that respect. I'd like to do that by taking you back to my childhood, a long time ago, but I was a child who grew up on the Central Line in London. I grew up on the eastern end of the Central Line. And what I did and what I realized when I had children of my own, what people do when they navigate, of course, along a line, how do you tell people when you're going to get off, where you're going to, what the destination is? Very simple, you count stops. I mean, it's, again, very obvious, but children can do this from perhaps even before they can properly read. They can just make out that some words are different, and you can tell them, oh, it's in 5-stop time, and they're able to count the stops. But what do you count? When you're counting the stops, you're not counting these. These are the stops. You're counting the labels. And the problem is that if you are really rigid in your design rules and you say, okay, text and lines must not interact ever, no matter what, it forces you to place what you're counting on different sides of the linear here, and it must slow down people's ability to count along a line and say, well, Leighton to Hainault, how many stops is that? Well, okay, it's 1, 2, am I up there, down, and it slows you down. It's not optimal, that's for sure. Conversely, there are obviously examples, Yo showed them in his presentation, and I will mirror that now, where you can have the text incredibly standardized at the top. And you might think, yep, absolutely, I can count this very easily. I can see 5 stops from now. I know what it might be. But be careful. Because you might think maybe if you're heading towards the right, it's not neither east, west, north, or southbound here, but if you're heading towards the right from the lycée through to Président Hollande, Raymond Aron, Georges Mandel, then you might think that would be the order, because that's the order that you see the text, 1, 2, 3, 4, going from left to right. But you would be wrong. The actual true order of the stops is as shown at the top. And that's because you then have to go from incredibly well-presented text, very standardized, to then make sense of what the actual network is doing underneath. And this represents the actual sequence of stops. And of course, then you have the problem of having to tie the stops in with the labels. So problems with both approaches. This can be very difficult to achieve in this particular format, of course. It's very hard to represent especially bus services in the Parisian region. They do some very interesting things, very odd services sometimes, lots of exceptions. But yep, static information's got to be thought through. I don't know if this is an oxymoron, but should static information be allowed to move fast and break things? Now, this is a little bit of a non-fashionable phrase anymore. I think it used to be adopted by, was it Facebook who first came up with this? Or maybe it's Google. Anyway, definitely not fashionable. But the idea is, of course, in the dynamic world, it seems to me like apps and digital is given more license to be innovative, to be different, to try new things, to try and tackle problems that haven't been solved by static information. But can we empower static information in the same way that digital is allowed to do? Just in conclusion, if we are in this transition between all static to all digital, and of course we're in the middle of it, this transition is going to be an incredibly long one, no matter what we might think, no matter how quickly we think that digital technology is going to be universal. It's going to be an incredibly long transition, and we might not actually complete it. We might always have static information. So we should just keep that in mind, be realistic. So if you are a designer of static information, or just you love it, and I think a lot of us are in this room, take care of it. Seek to improve its impact, its completeness. A huge problem, and we should not overlook this fact, is that there's so many networks out there that just don't have information full stop. A lot of bus networks in Germany, for instance, there is no information at the bus stop about where those buses might go. In fact, that's common for buses all over. Static and dynamic, of course, can be complementary. Not have to fight for supremacy. They can be part of the overall system. And of course, static information, it has value, but ultimately, good cartography is good cartography regardless of the channel. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. Any questions? Yes.
Hi. First of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation on T-Carter and what you did as a project. My question is that you mentioned about OpenStreetMaps, and you mentioned that there is the normal layer where you say it looks earthy and whatnot. My question is that on the OpenStreetMap itself, can you change the appearance, for example, the colors from the original one to, let's say, your one that you showed there for your wayfinding or something like that? Yeah.
And the short answer is yes. You can restyle the layers as you require. Much harder would be to change the actual geometry, the shape of things as they're represented. But just to restyle is a fairly simple process, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? No, I have a question.
Sure.
How do you move fast and break things?
I don't know. Probably the mantra should be go slowly and maintain things. Honestly, the biggest problem is a lack of long-term thinking. And this is true even with customers that we've had for literally decades, where there's a lot of money, or there's relatively a lot of money at the beginning of a project. So for a capital project, it's funded. The money runs out very quickly, and there's very rarely, one or two exceptions, the money to keep it going long term. And that I find very baffling, that it's just not treated as essential, as a necessity. It's still thought of as, let's try this project now. It's a cool mapping thing. We redesign something, we add a new product here. But no, it needs to be maintained. Otherwise, as soon as it loses its accuracy, its relevancy, its recency, then the whole system falls apart. So maintenance is everything.
I think very interesting talk. And when I have been teaching generally wayfinding to students, I always make it a point, because nowadays UX has become a buzzword, and there are more people who are getting trained in UX by doing a 2 weeks course and saying that I know heuristics. Okay, so that's a tough challenge in front of us. But I think this is a very interesting points that you mentioned of comparison. And whenever I introduce wayfinding, I actually tell them that wayfinding and placement of information should work with these 10 principles. And they exactly apply in a space where you actually physically move. So thanks for bringing it up. And I just got a confidence that yes, what I was saying makes sense. The second part that I wanted to ask you is have you ever tried monetizing these maps? So I'll just give you an example that once we did one map and we approached few locations around the station.
Yep.
And said, okay, you have a shop, we'll put your shop name over here, and yeah, are you ready to pay for it? And I could see people getting interested into it. So have you ever tried that?
So I will extend that question on behalf of our customers, the transport authorities, the city authorities. Have they ever tried? Yes. Have they ever been successful? No. And as a purist, I'm happy with that. As a pragmatist, maybe not so much. But the problem is that if you allow people to pay for their presence on the map, then essentially you'll end up with a base map like Google's, where people are literally paying to be on the map, because to be off the map is to not exist. And what does that mean? It means that you have a map that is not optimized for the purpose that you really want to optimize it for: transport, pedestrian wayfinding, cycle wayfinding. And so maybe you end up having to develop different executions of the same product just to cater for those different audiences, and each one is non-optimal. So that would be the problem with sort of paying to be on the map. Of course, some people don't use literal money, they use more soft power to influence whether they're on or not. The thing I like about Legible London, the principle of Legible London, is that something is shown because it's good for wayfinding. So is it big? Is it architecturally interesting? Does it have a huge sign on the outside so somebody can see it on the map and immediately reference it? It doesn't matter if it's a commercial, if it's private, if it's, worthy, a traditional point of interest. Is it good for wayfinding? And that's the metric. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Oh, another question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I guess a realization I had was the transition between static and dynamic mapping is to sort of have more types of maps or more unique maps to sort of showcase these different situations that you were talking about, like the different strategies of reorientation and focus. I feel like that's sort of the natural progression of having things be less cognitively heavy for the user to use. But how do you sort of balance that uniqueness with the standardization of like let's say a transport company or a client would rather have less maps because it's easier to install and easier to maintain? How do you balance how much uniqueness you need for these types of maps, and how do you convince clients that, oh, this is actually what's needed for this situation, rather than just a blanket solution of one map designed for everything?
Very good question. I don't think we'd ever argue for less maps, so more maps is great. But in all seriousness, the thing I've realized is, as we're producing these maps that are specific to a particular location is that they're not the type of map that maybe we would sort of take home and study and pore over and close and bring back the next day and look at it again and find new things. They're meant to be functional. They're meant to be that you literally can get the information as you're walking past, or you can just reference it in 10 seconds, 15 seconds, find what you need and move on. Because it's for transport, right? It's for an environment where you don't want people to dwell. You don't want them to occupy the space when there might be other people behind them who also need that same information. So they've got to be performant in that way. And then the success or not just comes down to measurement. You know, is that map actually performing its purpose? And if it's not, then the operators will tell you very quickly.
Yeah, I was also wondering, because you mentioned the Apple Vision Pro, and
Whoops.
I was wondering, how do you like speculate, or what are your visions for the future of mapping and wayfinding, like 5, 10, 15 years? How do you think it might affect, change the way you design maps and generally experience the world?
I don't know. I've started to not really think too much about the future. I think it's a little bit like we had an experience with waiting for a bus a couple of days ago, which was always 5 minutes away. 5 minutes later, 5 minutes away. It's a bit like the future for mapping. It's always, you know, it's coming next year. Or automated driving, all these things that are potentially promised in 6 months, 1 year, and they're still 6 months or 1 year or 2 years or 5 years away. Whereas the core needs can still be addressed right now by existing, maybe not attractive, it's not, I didn't want to mention AI or anything like that, although I'm sure that's going to be brought up at some point. Some say, what about AI and wayfinding? Please no, but probably it's going to come very soon. So I don't know if the future is, you know, us all walking around with things, augmented reality devices on our face. Maybe it will be in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, something like that. And you can imagine that the ability not just to, as actually Zach demonstrated it yesterday, it's not the ability to tailor one map for one specific use, it's to tailor that map for one specific user. And that is really interesting. So if that's the future, I welcome it.
Move on to the panel. Sorry, no more questions. Thank you very much, Sergio.